it's not political because I think the elephant represents either the Democrats or the Republicans in the United States. So I don't want you to associate me particularly. Although from what I say next, you may have a pretty clear idea where my political leanings lie. I've decided to call this sermon. I don't usually tell you what my titles are, but I called this one "FaceTime with God." FaceTime with God. Did you ever find yourself saying something like, God, why don't you fix this? Or why don't you just show yourself so all the world can see and we can just get on with life together, knowing that you are there and that you care? It's a natural thing for us human beings to seek certainty. I know I seek it. I just want to know how all this is going to turn out. Carrying this burden of faith, just trusting without seeing, sometimes feels a bit heavy to carry. I just want reassurance. I mean, I can go with some of what the hymn writer says. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. Yes, knowing Jesus as I do gives me some assurance. It assures me of his acceptance with all my unworthiness. That's personal, and it helps. But the question I'm asking leads to a different answer. It's bigger than personal, it has to do with our future, the future of our country, or even the human race. And it requires something more than a story or two in scripture, something more than a comforting hymn. What I'm seeking is some gesture from God, some revelation that's just going to leave us without any doubt about the outcome of the history of which we are such a tiny part as individuals. We're like ants, busy as can be, but being swept along by movements that cross the world and time like ocean currents that appear to be entirely indifferent to our plights as individuals. These movements are not something we seem to be able to influence greatly, even on the rare occasions when we actually attempt to work together. This pandemic is pushing us hard on this, individually, locally, nationally, and internationally. Will our sheer survival instinct enable us to overcome our differences and work together to turn the tide on the effects of the coronavirus? Well, we sure hope so. And in some really important respects, the success or failure is on us. We don't expect God to fix this. And this is true for some of the other biggies as well, like the environment and systemic racism. What can we as individuals do? And how will it turn out? As adult Christians, we don't really expect God to address us and reassure us on this, not in the dramatic way that I'm, talking about it as I open this. Now, before I go any further, I need to say I'm taking my cue for what I'm about to say next from today's scripture reading from Exodus. In this passage, we find Moses talking to God and looking for some assurance that God is going to stick with him and the people he is leading to a land promised to the patriarch Abraham. Moses pushes God hard on this. He's not satisfied with God's assurances. He wants a face-to-face meeting. It sounds a bit like someone who's not satisfied with assurances over the phone and needs a face-to-face. We could spend a lot of time reflecting on these frank exchanges between Moses and God. There are several others throughout the book of Exodus. They're a fascinating study in themselves, and they are unique in the scriptures. I mean, not even Jesus talks to God the way Moses appears to in the book of Exodus. Much as we might wonder where, if anywhere, we might turn to find reassurance, I don't think any of us really expects God to appear and reassure us at this point. But it does feel as if we're at some critical turning point in history. It is a point where the results in one scenario are absolute and terrible disaster. And in the alternative, the whole of humanity will benefit. I sometimes think the outcome of the upcoming US presidential election is the pivot, the key event that will determine whether we move in the direction of world salvation or world disaster nationally and internationally. And that impression is magnified in the context of this pandemic and the catastrophic way the Trump administration has handled it. In fact, it's clear it's not even the administration that has handled it so badly. It goes right to the top. The administration is held hostage to the president's behavior and attitudes. Now, I'm sure someone will say, come on, Patrick, get a grip. Sure, this is a significant election. 4 more years with Mr. Trump as president would cement policies that have been implemented, strategies that have been employed, and attitudes that have surfaced in Trump's first years in office. But we can't forget what he has done and would continue to do does have the support of a significant number of Americans, and policies, attitudes, and strategies like this are used by other leaders around the world. Broad strokes, to take one dynamic, the tension between business interests and the threat of climate change are not just at issue in the US. They are here as well. We experience it in Canada, most acutely in the tension between the continual development of fossil fuels and the perceived need to replace them entirely as a source of energy. We want more environmentally friendly sources of energy, solar energy, wind energy, various forms of hydroelectricity. There's even a revival of the use of nuclear energy, but in smaller, more localized forms. But that one, the nuclear energy option, is almost as loaded as processing more of the tar sands. We need energy. We need energy to heat our homes, to fuel our transportation, and to power our industries. And we all know that. And for a couple of 100 years now, most of that energy has come from high carbon emission fossil fuels. And there are huge business interests, big money, resisting any significant move away from these fossil fuels. And those interests get translated into political power. Among other things, and there are many other things, the Trump administration, with the support of a Republican Senate, supports the fossil fuel industry and downplays the significance of climate change. And again, they're not alone in this around the world. And that's just one big issue. It is global in its impact, and we feel it politically and economically here in Canada. I could go on with issues of racial inequality, of Indigenous rights, of growing economic inequality in wealthy nations. Oddly enough, one of the, on the one hand, wealthy and powerful economies are producing increasing disparities between the rich and the poor at home and threatening to wipe out the middle class. While on the other hand, globalization has allowed have-not countries to benefit significantly and lift more and more people out of poverty. One of Trump's big political levers is to retrieve the jobs America was outsourcing to poorer countries and bring those jobs back home. Well, we've heard that here too. Industry balked because that would mean higher wages and higher costs and higher prices and loss of competitive edge. And so along with shaming American industries for letting the jobs go out of the country, Trump has also deregulated business and freed it up to do whatever it took to become, or whatever it takes to become competitive. The question that soon comes up is whether it's better to regulate bad behavior or criminalize it. To take an analogy from sports, except in extreme circumstances, we don't put hockey players in jail for breaking the rules. We put them in the penalty box. That's what regulations are about. Take the regulations away and you open the door to chaos. One way or the other, it is the consumer or the recipient of services who suffers from unregulated behavior. And sometimes the consequences are the difference between life and death. I don't have to tell you how this has played out in the US with the chaotic messaging and practices around shutting down and reopening businesses, or as Trump likes to put it, getting the economy going again. We can't sit around in our basements and wait for the economy to come back. And that's true, except that it leaves out the part that asks, who will work and who will buy if we're all too sick and our hospitals are too full to care for us? We can't afford to be smug here in Canada, but thank God we have governments that keep holding our feet to the fire and who are there in concrete ways to dull the impact of business closures and job losses. As we keep hearing, this is a marathon, not a sprint. So it all sounds very secular and political. And my function, one of the functions I think we have as a church, is to look at this through a theological lens as well, and not just simply say, well, that's there. We just retreat into our churches and sing our hymns and reflect on the Psalms and some of the nice things that Jesus had to say. But that's not what we're called to do, really, as Christians, as persons of faith. So I've said we don't really expect God to fix this, but I do think we expect God's help in getting us through it. And I wonder if reading this passage from Exodus doesn't give us permission to speak frankly with God and to push God on this. We're facing forces that are just too big for one individual or even one nation to turn around. And yes, we need to do our bit and change our ways, but we need to keep knocking on heaven's door. Keep knocking. Let me end with this story. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. He said, in a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor had respect for people. In that city there was a widow who kept coming to him and saying, grant me justice against my opponents. For a while he refused, but later he said to himself, though I have no fear of God and no respect for anyone, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out by her continually coming. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to his chosen people who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long in helping them? I tell you, he will quickly grant justice to them. And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?